All right, guys. So we're going to be going into week 3 now. Um, this week is based on chapters 5 and 6 from your textbook. So we'll be starting here with our discussion on chapter 5, which is the different body tissues. All right. So within the human body, we're going to have 4 different types of tissue. Okay. There's going to be epithelial tissue. It basically, you could think of it as lining organs, providing gross level membranes. It's going to be important in protection of the body, like, with the skin. Then we have connective tissue, which really it holds stuff together. It supports different things. It's a big aspect of protection. It fills spaces and stores blood cells, all right, as well as produces them and is them, all right? The blood is a connective tissue. Then we have muscle tissue, which, everyone knows provides movement. Then we have nervous tissue, and nervous tissue conducts impulses and controls a lot of the bodily functions that are automatically handled. So, to start off talking about epithelia, we're going to start talking about the different types of epithelial cells. All right, so we kind of have 2 main classifications. Classification 1, real easy, is the number of layers that it has. And there's only 2 of these, okay? So we have simple epithelial tissue. Simple epithelial tissue literally only has 1 layer of cell, okay? Real easy to think about, all right? Simple has 1 layer. Next, the other classification is stratified. So stratified epithelia has multiple layers, okay? This can range from 2 to 50. It doesn't really matter, but as long as it has more than 1 layer of cell, it is stratified. Next, we then talk about the shape of the cell. And there are essentially 3 of these. There is squamous. Squamous cells are flat. There are cuboidal. Cuboidal cells, like their name implies, are shaped like a cube. And then columnar epithelia, which are shaped like columns. They're narrow, they're tall. Okay? And then we kind of have 2 very strange ones that don't necessarily fit those categories. And so these ones kind of stand on their own. But we have pseudostratified columnar epithelia. So notice the name pseudostratified. Okay? So with pseudostratified, pseudo means like false, fake. It's not stratified. It looks stratified though, right? So it kind of has irregularities in terms of how the components of the cell line up. And that's why it's called pseudostratified columnar epithelia. And pseudostratified columnar epithelia is actually really cool. This epithelia is actually important for our respiratory function. So it lines the internal respiratory passages, right? And on the outside surface of this epithelial tissue, there's going to be what's called cilia. And you can think of cilia as arms, okay? So the cilia on this columnar epithelia actually pushes things along. So when we think about the respiratory system, we want to keep everything but air out of our lungs, right? We don't want, dust, water, um, bacteria, anything like that. So the inside of our respiratory passages are lined with these cells. There's also going to be another type of cell called goblet cell, which goblet cells secrete mucus. Okay, and mucus is important in this function because mucus is a good, almost, I guess you could say, trap for things like dust and other bacteria. And so when stuff ends up in that mucus, the cilia actually starts to push that mucus up towards the exit of the respiratory passage. And this is a process, we actually have a name for it. It's called the mucociliary escalator. Okay, so it plays a major role in respiratory function, even though this is really the only place that it occurs in the body. The other type that doesn't really fit any category is what's called transitional epithelia. When you look in the textbook, you'll see pictures of all these different types. This one just doesn't exactly fit any description in comparison to the other, and that's because of its function. It actually exists so it can stretch, okay? And this is important because we actually see it lining the bladder and the ureters and the proximal portion of the urethra. All of those must be able to stretch to accommodate urine, okay? So it looks different than the rest of the epithelia, but that's because of its function, okay? So there's a couple other types we'll go through by combining these two different categories. So you'll have simple squamous epithelia. Simple squamous epithelia is fun because it's one layer of single flat cells. This functions really well in areas that are going to do filtration, where there's going to be diffusion, osmosis, anything like that, to where substances need to be able to go to various different places. So we see simple squamous epithelia lining the alveoli in the lungs, which is actually the portion of the lung where oxygen actually enters the body. We see it lining capillaries, lymph vessels. It's going to be on a lot of other membranes, and it typically is the membrane that covers all organs. Next, simple cuboidal epithelia. Secretion and protection is a big part of this. You see it covering the surface of the ovaries, and it's also going to line kidney tubules and some ducts within glands. And this is going to be important because cuboidal epithelia functions really well, especially in the kidney tubules, for the filtration of what we call filtrate, which gets turned into urine. Functions really well for that, and we'll cover all of that later in the course. Next, there's the simple columnar epithelia. So remember, this is a true one-layer columnar epithelia, and it looks real nice under a microscope because all the nuclei tend to line up really well, unlike pseudostratified columnar epithelia, where the nuclei can be all over the place to give that false multi-layered look. Simple columnar epithelia typically can have an appendage on it called microvilli. Now, you can think of microvilli as kind of the opposite of cilia. What microvilli actually function to do is you can kind of think about them as the nozzle on a vacuum cleaner hose, right? They kind of poke off, they hang off from the side of the cell, and their job is to pull things in. So we see these functioning, along the uterus, within the stomach, and the intestines. So this is how we absorb nutrients in the digestive system using these columnar epithelial cells and their microvilli. Next, stratified squamous epithelia. Really, when we talk about stratified in general, you want to think protection, okay? There's a reason that there's multiple layers of cells. So stratified squamous epithelia, really you should think skin. Our skin has a lot of layers to it, lots and lots of layers. But you also want to think any other part of the body that comes into contact with other surfaces where there can be a lot of friction, okay? So the lining of the oral cavity is another great example. Then there is stratified cuboidal epithelia. This is going to line the ducts of glands. So again, think of cuboidal, think of it lines glands, okay? And then there's a stratified columnar epithelia. This is, again, another rarer tissue type, but we only see it occurring in certain parts of the male urethra as well as lining large excretory ducts. Okay, so next, moving on to connective tissue. All right, connective tissue is, as I said before, it really you should think of as supporting tissue. All right, whether it's physically supporting or supporting in a biochemical way like blood cells. So a couple general components of connective tissues we want to consider. We can kind of break this into two classes. There's cells. So like I said, I've already mentioned blood cells. Our blood is a connective tissue. But we also want to think about things like fibroblasts. Fibroblasts exist to create connective tissue fibers. Macrophages are a type of white blood cell that do phagocytosis, which is the process where a cell pretty much engulfs other matter. And then there's mast cells, and mast cells are kind of another white blood cell cousin, if you will. They function heavily in the inflammation response. So really what inflammation is a increase in the amount of fluid and white blood cells going to an area that's damaged, okay? And this occurs via mast cells secreting histamine. Histamine is kind of like an alarm that says, hey, white blood cells, come check this out, all right? Now, there's a lot more to the inflammatory response than just histamine and mast cells, but they do play a major role, especially with infection. Now, when we talk about the extracellular components of connective tissue, right, we want to look at various fiber types. So when we say extracellular, we're looking at stuff that's not a cell, but it's produced. So typically these are going to be like proteins and things of that nature. So there's collagen. Collagen is big in the physical strength of items. Elastic fibers. Elastic fibers typically are made of a component called elastin. These need to be able to stretch a little bit, have to have a little bit of a give. Then there's reticular fibers. Reticular fibers, they're another support substance. And then there's something called ground substance, which fills space around tissue. Okay. Next, we kind of have three sort of categories of the actual connective tissue itself, right? So that's going to be loose connective tissue, dense connective tissue, and then specialized connective tissue. So when we look at the loose connective tissues, we can see that there's a couple different types. So areolar tissue typically is what we see binding organs together. It's kind of the tissue that exists between the skin and the layers under the skin, between muscles. It's all over the place. Okay, it's not particularly strong, but it kind of keeps things from moving out of order. Next is adipose tissue. Adipose tissue simply is fat tissue. Okay, it stores fat. It functions primarily to protect and insulate the body. There's reticular connective tissue. Reticular connective tissue, not really as important. It's, again, just a general support tissue, and we really only see it in the liver and spleen, but it plays a role in the structure of a lot of other organs. Then there's dense connective tissue, and this is pretty much what a lot of people think of when they think of connective tissue. These are the tendons, the ligaments, the actual base layer of the skin. These connective tissues are actually really tough. They're hard to damage. And they do a lot of the main work of holding things together. Now, for specialized connective tissue, there is hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage we see on the ends of bones. It makes up part of the nose, and it's in the rings that kind of line the trachea, okay? Elastic cartilage is what we see in the ear and different parts of the voice box. This cartilage has to be able to move, and it, especially in the voice box, needs to be able to move to help shape the sound that comes out. Then there's fibrocartilage. We see this really between bony parts of the spinal column. So that's actually the interventricular discs. So when someone says they have a herniated disc in their back, well, that disc is fibrocartilage, okay? But it also exists in different parts of the pelvic girdle, where the pelvic bones kind of join together at the pubic symphysis, and it exists in other places like the knee, and in the knee, you would hear it called a meniscus, okay? And the other two that I've already mentioned, bone and blood. All right, so then next, muscle tissue. Muscle tissue is fun because this tissue has the ability to create movement. All right. There is 3 types of muscle tissue, and these really are based on kind of where we find them. There's skeletal muscle, which, for obvious reasons, it's connected to the skeleton, right? It causes the skeleton to move. So this is the muscle that most people primarily think of. Then there's what's called a cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is literally the muscle of the heart. It is very similar to skeletal muscle in terms of its base function, but, or I should say its base structure when you look at the types of cells, but there's very small structural differences that actually cause it to rely on different substances more than skeletal muscle. And we'll talk about this more, obviously, when we cover the muscular system. And then the final type is smooth muscle. And you can think of smooth muscle as muscle that is involved in organs. It's involved in the viscera. So our small intestines are lined, or well, not just the small, but small and large intestines are lined with smooth muscle. The esophagus is smooth muscle. This muscle looks very different than the other two types because it's smooth, right? And that brings me to the next thing to talk about is what's called striations. So when you look in the textbook at the pictures, you can see on cardiac and skeletal muscle what appears to be very distinct lines between the muscle cells, okay? That doesn't exist in smooth muscles. That structure isn't there. And that is part of the function of smooth muscle. And another aspect when we talk about muscle is whether it's voluntary or involuntary. So skeletal muscle is the only voluntary muscle. Smooth muscle and cardiac muscle are both involuntary. Okay. And again, while I could talk forever about muscle, we'll really be covering this in detail later. Next, there's the nervous tissue. And, everyone kind of already knows what the nervous system does, right? So the nervous system pretty much conducts electrical impulses, and it stimulates muscles, it stimulates glands, and it leads to pretty much the major control of the body in every sense, right? The nervous tissue itself gets a little complicated, but we pretty much want to look at just really neurons for now. But there's also something called neuroglial cells, and neuroglial cells are cells that are the support for neurons. Now, that's just a classification. There's many different types of those cells, like Schwann cells or oligodendrocytes, and those cells do various different things, but that's stuff that we'll really talk about later. So for now, just think neuroglial cells as support for the neurons. So the neurons really are the star of the show with nervous tissue, and these cells we can think of really in three different ways. They can be what's called an afferent neuron, which means they are sensory, or they can be an efferent neuron, okay? And efferent neurons are motor. And by motor, that means that they are stimulating a gland or a muscle, right? Then the third category is what we typically find in between those neuron types, and those are called interneurons. You can think of interneurons as kind of like the mail carrier, right? So someone puts the afferent neuron, sends a signal through the postal service, you could say. So it's putting a letter in the mail. The interneuron takes that letter and then gives it to the efferent neuron. The efferent neuron, in this case, is the person receiving the mail, okay? So you can generally think of neurons as having one of those three functions. So next, the integumentary system. So the integumentary system really is the skin, it's the hair, it's the nails, all right? So when we talked about epithelial tissue earlier, that's a big portion of this, all right? There's a lot of epithelia within the epidermis especially. So you'll see here this diagram, I believe it's also in your textbook, the many different parts of the skin. So the big things to start off with, right, is the very top outermost layer is the epidermis, okay? So if we look at the name, epi means upon, dermis. Dermis is the next layer of skin below, right? So the dermis, you can kind of think of as the meat and potatoes, or kind of everything that's important for the skin's function. This is kind of where most of that resides, okay? And then below that, we have what's called the subcutaneous layer. The subcutaneous layer is where the vascular support, the main neurons, start to branch off. There's a lot of fat tissue here for protection and for insulation. But we see really the dermis and epidermis being kind of the stars of the show here. And you can kind of call the epidermis and the dermis together the cutaneous portion of the skin, whereas there's the subcutaneous layer. Big thing to talk about with the epidermis is it has several different layers, right? So there's the stratum corneum and the stratum basal. All right, there's other layers in this, but to begin talking about it, the stratum basal is really where a lot of the cell proliferation occurs, right? So in the stratum basal, we have a lot of cell division. So you can think of the epidermis on the skin as growing outward. All right. So as those cells divide, more cells get pushed up. And so that the actual outermost layer, called the stratum corneum, those cells are pretty much dead. They don't really function metabolically anymore, and they're tightly packed. But a cool part about the stratum corneum is that these cells are full of what's called keratin, which is a protein that is tough, it's fibrous, and it's waterproof. Okay? And this is where we see a big part of the protective aspect of the skin. Okay? So, the next layer that we would see, the stratum lucidum, is only in certain parts of the body. And it's when the stratum lucidum exists, we call that skin thick skin because there's an additional layer, okay? We only see it in the skin that's hairless. So really, it's essentially just the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet, all right? In the rest of the skin, this stratum lucidum doesn't exist. So following that, we would go to the stratum granulosum. Below the stratum granulosum is the stratum spinosum. And then below the stratum spinosum is finally the base layer, the stratum basal, which sits upon what's called the basement membrane. A lot of tissues have what's called a basement membrane, and you can think of the basement membrane as the most metabolically and cell reproductively active area within a tissue. Other aspects of the skin, we have sebaceous glands that exist to produce what's called sebum, and sebum is an oil, and this oil is actually a big part of why our skin is slightly acidic, and it's slightly acidic as a role to kill off some bacteria. So it plays a major role in the barrier defenses of our immune system. The sebaceous glands are pretty much always kind of attached to the hairs. So through the skin, we have a hair that comes through, We're not really sure what purpose the hair and the skin provides. There used to be a theory that existed saying that when the hairs stand up, based on things like air resistance and stuff, it kind of helps keep you warm. But we've kind of shown that if that's what it's for, it doesn't actually do that. So we're not really sure why. We also see attached to that hair what's called the erector pili muscle. So every hair has an erector pili muscle, and that muscle is what's responsible for making your hair stand up. There's special neurons that wrap around these hairs, and those neurons are able to detect movement in the hair. And so you can kind of think of if someone's touching the hair on your arm but not actually touching your skin, you can still feel it, right? And it's because of those neurons that wrap around the hair and sense where the hair's at. We've also got other different types of neurons in the tissue, and these all do slightly different things. So there's right here, Pacinian corpuscles. Up here is a Meissner corpuscle. Both of these play a big role in the sensation of touch, right? So the Meissner corpuscle, being close to the surface, really plays a big role in very light touch, whereas the Pacinian corpuscle, on the other hand, is really a deep pressure touch, okay? We also see there's some thermoreceptors that are within there, which I don't believe are going to be on here. But then there's also two different types of sweat glands. There's apocrine and there's merocrine sweat glands. And these sweat glands play a big role in the regulation of body temperature. So when the sweat gland releases sweat, the water within it evaporates off of the surface of the body, and that process actually removes temperature from the area, right? Because that process requires energy. So it feeds off of the heat energy from the area. Another big portion for the skin, while we're not photosynthetic animals, our skin does use sunlight to make vitamin D, and vitamin D is very important in a lot of bodily functions, especially in the ability to utilize calcium. And everyone knows calcium is very important for bone health as well as teeth health and a lot of other things. And another thing to cover that's not within this lecturette is talking about the healing of wounds, right? So a big thing to know is the kind of 4 cardinal signs of inflammation. It's going to be redness, heat, swelling, and pain, right? So those are the 4 signs of inflammation. They're pretty much always going to be present. Now, when we talk about damage to the skin, right? Let's say, you've accidentally cut yourself, all right? And the cut extends down into the dermis, and you got a little bit of bleeding because you've cut this blood vessel right here, right? It's not a big deal. We have what's called a clotting cascade that will take effect. And the blood vessel will kind of heal itself first, right? So macrophages, like we talked about earlier, and other phagocytic cells, they come in, they'll start to clean up dead tissue. We have fibroblasts. They'll play a role in secreting collagen and helping rebuild the blood vessel. And a big thing to note is that when you have a really large wound, we typically see the formation of what's called granulation that these develop within that wound. And those are going to be small, round masses. And those masses are actually new parts of a blood vessel being created, and it's actually surrounded by fibroblasts. So it's really cool that in larger wounds, we can actually kind of see this process happening in front of us. But essentially, once the fibroblasts do their job, the collagen's secreted, the blood vessels are remade, they leave, and we kind of see what's left over after that, and that's a fibrous scar that is pretty much what you would describe as a scab. Okay, so a scab really is a fibrous mass of tissue that exists until the epithelial tissue kind of pushes it off and replaces it with new keratinized stratum corneum layer, as well as any other layer below it that's damaged, right? And another cool thing to mention with the epidermis, so if a cut goes through the stratum basal, that's also not a very big deal because the stratum basal is smart enough that it can divide sideways as well. And you can kind of see issues with that with different types of cancer when you start to develop large masses. They'll kind of grow every which way. Another big thing to look at in the text, make sure you kind of read through the common skin disorders. Those are going to be potentially important to know.